There is a place beneath the heart of Rome where no one may enter without permission. A place where history is not displayed but locked away, hidden in the deepest rooms behind 3 layers of iron doors, between walls that carry no echo. There, the Vatican has preserved millions of pages of documents for over 12 centuries, not to reveal them but to wait. I know this because I have been there. Not as a scholar, not as a cardinal, certainly not as anyone the world would recognize. I was a custodian, a keeper of keys, a man whose only duty was to clean the floors and deliver approved documents to the few who were allowed to ask for them. But on certain nights, when the old priest had dozed off and the oil lamp burned quietly in the corner, I would quietly open doors that no one else dared to approach. And from that moment on, there was no turning back. My name does not matter now. What matters is what I found in those rooms where the air itself feels heavy with secrets that were never meant to see daylight. I have held letters written by popes that were never sent. I have read the forbidden copies of books that once changed the world but were declared too dangerous to exist. I have stood before paintings by Caravaggio that hang in darkness because the eyes in those portraits look straight into a kind of pain that theology dared not face. I do not have much time left. In these final years, my heart beats slower, my hands tremble when they touch the parchment that once felt as familiar as my own skin, and my eyes grow dim in the candlelight. But before all of it vanishes with me, I must speak. Not to shock, not to accuse or to absolve, but so that someone out there may understand. Truth has never fully belonged to the light, nor to the darkness. It dwells in the space between, waiting to be heard. I have seen the letters never sent by Pope Pius XII, resting quietly in an unmarked drawer during the years when millions died and the Vatican chose silence over speech. I have read the trial records of men tortured until they confessed to crimes they did not commit, their screams recorded in careful Latin by priests who believed they were doing the work of God. I have come to know that what we are not permitted to reveal is not hidden because it is false, but because it is too true to be accepted. Why does the Vatican keep all of this but never speak of it? Why preserve the evidence of its own doubts, its own failures, its own complicity in the suffering of millions? These are the questions that haunted me in those silent hours beneath the earth, surrounded by centuries of memory that no one was allowed to remember. I do not ask you to believe me. I cannot offer proof the world would recognize. The documents I touched remain locked behind those 3 iron doors, and I will never return to that place. But if you are still listening, if you are still here, and if somewhere inside you still believe that beneath every haloed glory there lies something deeper, something unresolved, then perhaps you are the one I must say this to, because one day, those doors will not remain closed forever. And when they open, you will understand why I could never go back, why I chose to speak now, in the time I have left, rather than carry these shadows to my grave in silence. This is not a story about conspiracy. This is a story about the most deeply buried memories in the world of faith. Welcome to Secrets of the Vatican Archives, where we do not repeat what has already been told, but slowly uncover what was meant to be hidden. If what you have just heard feels like more than words, if it feels like a door quietly opening to something you have always suspected but never seen, I invite you to walk with me through what comes next. Subscribe to this journey, not for my sake, but so that others may find these hidden rooms when they are ready. And if you want to be here when the next door opens, turn on notifications. The stories waiting in the dark have been patient for centuries. They can wait a little longer for you. I used to believe the Vatican was simply a religious symbol, a place of prayers, of popes in white robes standing in the open air of St. Peter's Square, blessing crowds who came from every corner of the earth. That was the Vatican the world sees, the Vatican of sunlight and ceremony. But that is only the surface. The real Vatican, the one I came to know, exists in a place most of humanity will never be allowed to see. It begins with a walk through corridors that grow narrower with each turn, past frescoes whose colours have faded into whispers of what they once were. The air changes. It becomes cooler, drier. The sound of footsteps stops echoing. 3 iron doors. The first door is ornate, decorated with bronze reliefs depicting scenes from the Book of Revelation. Angels and demons locked in eternal struggle. The door is heavy, requiring 2 men to open it even with the proper key. Beyond it lies a corridor lit by electric lights that were installed sometime in the 1950s, harsh and cold against stone walls that were laid in the 1600s. The second door is simpler. Plain iron, no decoration, no inscription, just a lock that has been changed 7 times in the last century, each time after a pope died and a new one took his place. This door does not require strength to open, it requires permission. And permission is granted to fewer than 80 scholars each year, after months of applications, interviews, and background investigations. But it is the third door that matters most. The third door has no handle on the outside. It can only be opened from within, or by someone who knows which stone in the wall beside it will trigger the mechanism when pressed in a certain sequence. I learned that sequence by watching, by waiting, by becoming invisible enough that the old archivist forgot I was there. Behind that third door lies the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the secret archive of the Vatican. Though in Latin, the word secretum does not mean secret in the way we think of it now. It means private, personal, belonging to the Pope alone, not to the Church as a whole, and certainly not to the world. But privacy, as I learned, is just another word for control. The archive spans roughly 85 kilometers of shelving. If you tried to walk past every shelf, it would take you days. The catalogued entries number over 35,000, covering events from the 8th century to the present day. But these numbers mean nothing. Numbers cannot capture what it feels like to stand in a room where the temperature is kept at exactly 18 degrees Celsius and the humidity at 55%, where the silence is so complete you can hear the blood moving through your own veins. Some of the documents are written on vellum, the stretched and treated skin of calves, prepared by hands that have been dust for 1,000 years. The Latin is written in a script so dense and abbreviated that even scholars spend hours deciphering a single page. And the smell. Must and wax and something else, something older than memory, the scent of time itself. But it is not the age of these documents that makes them powerful. It is what they contain. In one section, labelled simply Inquisitio, are the trial records of the Roman Inquisition. Galileo Galilei's interrogation in 1633, the questions asked, the answers given, the threats made, his forced confession, written in his own trembling hand. Nearby, bundled in red ribbon that has turned brown with age, are letters exchanged between the Vatican and the court of King Philip IV of France, discussing what to do about the Knights Templar. These letters were written in 1307, just weeks before Friday, October 13th, when every Templar in France was arrested on the same morning. The archives hold a handwritten letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written the night before her execution in 1587. She wrote to the Pope, begging him to pray for her soul, knowing that by the time he read her words, her head would already be separated from her body. The letter is kept in a wooden box lined with velvet, and when I held it, I felt the weight of her fear pressed into the paper. There are documents related to the trial of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher burned at the stake in 1600 for insisting that the universe was infinite and filled with other worlds. His last words before the flames took him were recorded by a witness, filed away, and forgotten for centuries. He said, "Perhaps you who pronounce my sentence are in greater fear than I who receive it." The Vatican kept that statement. Why? To remember? To justify? Or simply because they could not bring themselves to destroy what they had done? In another vault, I found correspondence between the Vatican and Adolf Hitler's government. Hundreds of letters exchanged between 1933 and 1945, some discussing the Concordat, the treaty signed just months after Hitler rose to power, guaranteeing the Catholic Church certain freedoms in exchange for staying out of politics. Others are reports sent from German bishops to the Holy See, describing what was happening to the Jews, describing the camps, the deportations, the disappearances. These letters are not rumours, they are not conspiracy theories. They are official documents, written on letterhead, stamped with seals, filed in folders that were meant to remain closed for 70 years. And they were opened in 2020, not because the Vatican wanted transparency, but because the 70-year rule required it. Even now, most of what was released remains in Latin, untranslated, inaccessible to those who do not have the training to read it. And the most sensitive materials, the ones that might answer the questions we most want to ask, remain sealed. No explanation given, no timeline provided, just the same phrase repeated in the catalogue: access restricted by order of the Holy See. I came to understand, during my years in that place, that the archive is not meant to preserve history for the sake of truth. It is meant to preserve power, to control the narrative, to decide what can be known, and when, and by whom. The Vatican does not destroy evidence. That would be too obvious, too suspicious. Instead, it buries evidence under layers of bureaucracy, language barriers, and time itself. It waits for the witnesses to die, for the questions to fade, for the world to move on to newer crises and forget what was never answered. But some of us do not forget. And some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. On my last night in the archive, I stood in the room farthest from the entrance, a small chamber behind a wooden door inscribed with the Latin words Veritas temporis est. Truth belongs to time. Inside, there were no files, no shelves, only a wooden desk and a single blank book. The elderly archivist once whispered to me that this was the room where no more questions were asked. Only listening remained. I did not write anything in that book. I only sat, and I listened to the silence, and I thought about all the voices that had been locked away in this place. Voices that had screamed, voices that had begged, voices that had whispered truths the world was not allowed to hear. And I made a choice. Not to stay silent, not to protect what I had seen, but to speak while I still had breath, while someone might still listen. The 3 iron doors remain locked. But their secrets no longer belong only to the Vatican. They belong to you now. Friday, October 13th. If you have ever wondered why that date carries a shadow, why Friday the 13th feels like a day when misfortune waits around corners, the answer begins on that morning in France, when the sun rose over a kingdom that had been preparing in secret for months. Before dawn, royal soldiers moved through every city, every town, every village where the Knights Templar had established their houses. The orders were precise, simultaneous, inescapable. By the time the Templars woke that morning, they were already prisoners. Within hours, thousands of men who had once been the most powerful military and financial force in Christian Europe found themselves in chains. King Philip IV did not act alone. He could not have. The Templars answered only to the Pope, not to any earthly king. To destroy them required the cooperation, or at least the silence. And Pope Clement V, a French pope installed with Philip's support, gave both. The charges brought against the Templars were designed to horrify: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, engaging in obscene rituals involving a demon they called Baphomet, a name that appears nowhere in Christian theology, but was repeated in confessions extracted under conditions I will describe shortly. What I found in the Vatican archives was not the public record of these accusations. Those have been known for centuries. What I found were the private files, the ones that show what really happened behind the propaganda. The folder was labelled Confessiones Extracti. Confessions extracted. Not given, not volunteered. Extracted. Inside were detailed descriptions of the methods used to obtain testimony from captured Templars. The language was clinical, written by men who believed they were documenting holy work. Strappado, they called one technique. The prisoner's hands were tied behind his back, and he was hoisted into the air by a rope attached to his wrists. The full weight of his body hung from his shoulder joints. Sometimes they would drop him suddenly, stopping the rope just before he hit the ground, dislocating both shoulders in an instant. Another method involved placing the prisoner's feet close to burning coals, roasting them slowly until the skin blackened and peeled away. One record noted that the bones of a Templar knight named Geoffrey de Charny fell out of his feet 3 days after this treatment. He confessed to everything they asked. Later, when the torture stopped, he recanted everything. Then they tortured him again, and he confessed again. This cycle, confession under torture, recantation, more torture, more confession, was repeated with hundreds of Templars across France. The confessions were identical because the questions were identical. Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship an idol? Yes. Did you deny Christ? Yes. But here is what the public records do not tell you. What I found written in the margins of these documents in a different hand, perhaps added years later by an archivist who understood what he was reading. Next to Geoffrey de Charny's confession, someone had written in Latin, "Verba sub poena mortis non veritas." Words under pain of death are not truth. The Templars had been founded nearly 200 years earlier, in 1119. Their original purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. 9 knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and lived in the captured Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which is why they became known as the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. But protection required funding, and funding required organization. Within decades, the Templars had evolved into something unprecedented, a military order that was also a banking network. They owned fortresses across Europe and the Holy Land. They managed estates, collected taxes, and developed a system that allowed pilgrims to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another using encrypted letters of credit. They invented international banking. By 1300, the Templars were no longer just soldiers of God. They were creditors to kings, and King Philip IV of France owed them a staggering amount. Estimates suggest more than 50,000 silver marks, an impossible sum for a kingdom already bankrupted by wars and mismanagement. There is a ledger in the Vatican Archives, discovered in 2001 by an Italian historian named Barbara Frail, that changed everything we thought we knew about the Templar trials. It is called the Chinon Parchment, named after the castle in France, where a secret meeting took place in 1308, a full year after the mass arrests. At Chinon Castle, Pope Clement V sent 3 cardinals to interrogate the Templar leadership privately, away from King Philip's soldiers, away from the Inquisition's torture chambers. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and other high-ranking Templars were questioned. The Pope's representatives concluded that while some individual Templars may have committed sins, the order itself was not guilty of heresy. Clement V granted them absolution in private, but in public, he continued to support their suppression. In 1312, he officially dissolved the Templar order at the Council of Vienne, under intense pressure from King Philip. The Templars' vast wealth was supposedly transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order. But most of it vanished. Some went to the French crown, some disappeared entirely, and in 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burned alive in Paris. But as the flames rose around him, witnesses recorded his final words. He called upon God to summon both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to meet him before the throne of heaven within a year. Clement died 1 month later. Philip died 7 months after that. People called it the Templar curse. I call it coincidence, given meaning by guilt. What haunts me is not whether the curse was real. What haunts me is the question I kept returning to as I read these documents by candlelight in that locked room beneath the Vatican. Why did Pope Clement V absolve the Templars in private, but condemn them in public? Why keep the absolution secret for 700 years? The answer, I believe, is written in a note I found clipped to the Chinon Parchments file. It was undated, but the handwriting suggested it was added sometime in the 1600s. It read, "Absolutio concessa in secreto, condemnatio servata in publico pro pace regni." Absolution granted in secret, condemnation maintained in public for the peace of the kingdom. The Vatican chose political stability over truth. They chose the alliance with France over the lives of men they knew were innocent, and they filed the evidence of that choice away in a place where no one would find it for 7 centuries. But the story does not end with executions and curses. It ends with a question that has never been answered. Where did the Templar treasure go? Contemporary accounts describe the Templars as possessing unimaginable wealth, perhaps even knowledge, secret teachings they discovered during their years living on the Temple Mount, in the ruins of Solomon's Temple, where Jewish mysticism and early Christian history overlapped in ways the Church preferred to forget. On the night before the arrests, there are reports that several Templar ships left the port of La Rochelle in France, loaded with cargo, destination unknown. Some believe they sailed to Scotland, which did not recognize the papal order to suppress the Templars. In the Vatican archives, I found an inventory taken after the arrests, listing what was confiscated from Templar properties across France. It is exhaustive. Furniture, livestock, grain stores, armor, swords, but the amounts of gold and silver listed are absurdly small for an organization that had loaned 50,000 marks to the King of France alone. Someone had written in the margin, "Ubi est thesaurus?" Where is the treasure? No answer was recorded. There are those who believe the Templars hid sacred relics. The Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the head of John the Baptist. These are legends, myths that have grown over centuries, fed by novels and films and the human desire to believe that somewhere, hidden from unworthy eyes, there exists proof of the divine. I do not know if the Templars found relics. I know this because of a single line I discovered in a letter from a French bishop to Pope Clement, written in 1309, 2 years after the arrests. The bishop was reporting on the interrogation of a Templar chaplain who had served in Jerusalem. The chaplain claimed, under questioning, that the Templars had uncovered documents beneath the Temple Mount. Documents written in Hebrew and Greek, predating the official Gospels, containing teachings of Jesus that contradicted the Church's doctrine. The chaplain said these documents had been sent to the Templar headquarters in Paris before the arrests. The bishop's letter asked the Pope what should be done if these documents were found. The Pope's reply, written in his own hand, was brief. Igni tradantur, let them be given to fire. Whether those documents existed, whether they were found, whether they were burned, I do not know. But the fact that the question was asked, that the Pope felt the need to order their destruction, tells me that someone believed they were real. And if the Templars possessed knowledge that threatened the Church's version of Christian history, then their destruction was not about heresy or idol worship or King Philip's debts. It was about control, about ensuring that only one version of the story survived. I held the chinon parchment in my hands. The ink had faded to the colour of old blood, but the words were still legible. Absolutio. Absolution. The Vatican had known the truth for 700 years and said nothing. I thought about Jacques de Molay, burning in Paris, calling down judgment on those who had betrayed him. I thought about the thousands of Templars tortured into confessions they did not believe. I thought about the treasure that vanished, the documents that were burned, the questions that were buried under centuries of silence, and I understood something I had not wanted to accept. The Vatican does not guard truth. And when truth threatens power, truth is locked behind iron doors and left to rot in the dark, waiting for someone foolish enough to open those doors and speak what was never meant to be spoken. If you have made it this far with me, into these shadows of history, where the line between fact and legend blurs, I ask one thing. Subscribe to this journey, not for me, but so others may find what was meant to stay hidden, because the next door we open has waited even longer, and what it reveals will challenge everything you were taught about the foundations of science, faith, and the courage it takes to speak truth when the world demands silence. The Templars are gone, but their questions remain, and those questions, I have learned, are more dangerous than any treasure. The letter was dated August 4th, 1613. I found it folded inside a leather portfolio that had not been opened, as far as I could tell from the dust, in over a century. The handwriting slanted sharply to the right, as though the writer had been leaning towards something urgent. The ink had turned brown, but every word was still legible. Galileo Galilei was writing to his friend Benedetto Castelli, a fellow mathematician, trying to explain something that would, within 3 years, make him an enemy of the Church he had served his entire life. He was trying to explain how the Bible could still be true even if the earth moved around the Sunday. The intention of the Holy Scripture, he wrote, is to teach us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. It is one of the most elegant sentences ever written in defense of reason, and it terrified the Vatican. What most people know about Galileo is simplified into a story of science versus religion, enlightenment versus ignorance. The brave astronomer standing against the superstitious church, forced to recant his discoveries, muttering under his breath as he left the Inquisition chamber. And yet it moves. A perfect narrative. A moral fable. But the truth, as I discovered in the documents the Vatican kept hidden for centuries, is far more complicated and far more human. Galileo was not an atheist. He was a devout Catholic who believed deeply that God had written two books. One was scripture, written in words. The other was nature, written in mathematics. And he believed, with a conviction that would eventually destroy him, that both books came from the same author and therefore could not contradict each other. In 1609, Galileo built one of the first functioning telescopes in Europe. He did not invent it. That credit belongs to Dutch lensmakers, but Galileo perfected it, turning a novelty into an instrument of discovery. And when he aimed it at the night sky, he saw things no human eye had ever seen before. 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, mountains and craters on the surface of our moon, phases of Venus, stars invisible to the naked eye, thousands of them, scattered across the heavens in numbers that suggested the universe was far larger than anyone had imagined. He published these findings in a short book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. It made him famous across Europe almost overnight. Princes wanted to meet him. Scholars debated his observations. The Medici family in Florence hired him as their court mathematician. He was celebrated for a while. The problem was not that Galileo claimed the Earth moved. The problem was that he insisted on it publicly, repeatedly, and in Italian rather than Latin, which meant common people could read his arguments. He made the dangerous move of taking a scientific debate out of the universities and into the streets. In 1616, the Church's response came swiftly. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, one of the most powerful theologians in Rome, summoned Galileo and delivered a warning. The doctrine that the sun is the center of the universe was, according to the Holy Office, foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. Heretical. That word carried weight in 1616. It carried fire. It carried the memory of Giordano Bruno, burned alive just 16 years earlier for proposing that the universe was infinite and filled with other worlds. The official decree was published. Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus, which had been in circulation for over 70 years without serious objection, was suddenly added to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, a list that would eventually grow to include works by Descartes, Spinoza, John Milton, and in 1859, Charles Darwin. Galileo was instructed to abandon his views, to stop teaching heliocentrism, to accept that the Earth stood still at the center of God's creation, just as Scripture suggested, just as Aristotle had claimed, just as the Church had taught for over 1,000 years. And for a while, Galileo obeyed. But silence, I have learned, is a difficult vow for a man who has seen the truth. In the Vatican Archives, I found letters exchanged between Jesuit astronomers in the 1620s. These were men who had access to telescopes, men who had repeated Galileo's observations and confirmed them. They had seen the moons of Jupiter. They had seen the phases of Venus. They knew, privately, that Galileo was right. One letter, written by Father Christoph Scheiner in 1629, contains a line that made my hands shake when I read it. The evidence is clear, but we cannot say so. The Jesuits were caught between two authorities: the authority of observation, of mathematics, of the physical world that God himself had created, and the authority of Scripture as interpreted by the Church, of tradition, of the theological system that held Christian Europe together. They chose institutional loyalty over empirical truth, and they were not happy about it. Galileo, meanwhile, grew bolder. In 1632, he published his masterwork, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It was written as a conversation between three characters: Salviati, who argued for the Copernican system, Simplicio, who defended the old Aristotelian view, and Sagredo, the neutral observer. Simplicio was a fool. His arguments were weak, his logic embarrassing, and everyone in Rome knew that Simplicio's words were often direct quotes from Pope Urban VIII, who had once been Galileo's friend and patron. Urban felt publicly humiliated, and in 1633, Galileo was summoned to Rome to stand trial before the Inquisition. He was 70 years old. His health was failing. The journey from Florence to Rome nearly killed him. But he came because refusal meant immediate arrest and likely the fate that had befallen Bruno. The trial transcript still exists, filed in a folder marked Galileo Processus. I read it over 3 nights, sitting in the archive long after the other scholars had left, the pages illuminated by a lamp that cast shadows across Latin questions and Italian answers. The interrogation was careful, precise. The inquisitors did not ask Galileo whether the earth moved. They asked whether he had been instructed in 1616 not to teach that doctrine. Galileo said yes. They asked whether he had obeyed that instruction. Galileo tried to argue that his dialogue was not a defense of heliocentrism, but a neutral examination of both sides. The inquisitors were not convinced. There is a note in the margin of one transcript page, written by the presiding cardinal, threaten with torture if he does not confess. They never actually tortured him. The threat was enough. Galileo was old, sick, and terrified. He had watched what happened to those who defied the church. He knew the limits of his courage. On June 22nd, 1633, Galileo knelt in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome and read aloud a confession that had been written for him. His voice, witnesses reported, trembled. I, Galileo Galilei, son of the late Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, aged 70 years, arraigned personally before this tribunal, and kneeling before you, most eminent and reverend Lord Cardinals, Inquisitors General, against heretical depravity throughout the entire Christian Commonwealth, having before my eyes and touching with my hands the Holy Gospels, swear that I have always believed, do believe, and by God's help will, in the future, believe all that is held, preached, and taught by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Then came the words they required. I abjure, curse, and detest the errors and heresies of the movement of the earth. He signed the document. His handwriting, normally confident and flowing, was cramped and small. The legend says that as he rose from his knees, he muttered under his breath, "Eppur si move," and yet it moves. It is a beautiful story, defiant, romantic, almost certainly false. There is no contemporary record of those words. They appear in histories written a century later, when the trial had become a symbol and Galileo had become a martyr for science. But the truth is more painful than the legend. Galileo did not mutter defiance. He went home to his villa in Arcetri, near Florence, where he lived under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life. He was forbidden to publish, forbidden to leave his property without permission. He went blind in 1638, likely from decades of looking at the sun through his telescope without proper filters. In his final letters, which I found bundled with black ribbon, he wrote to friends about his despair. This universe which I, with marvelous observations and clear demonstrations, had enlarged 100,000 times, has now for me shrunk into the narrow confines of my own body. He died in January 1642, still under sentence of the Inquisition. The church refused to allow him a public funeral or a monument in the Basilica of Santa Croce, where other great Florentines were buried. His body was placed in a small room beneath the bell tower. Unmarked, unremembered, it stayed there for 95 years. The church did not formally admit its error regarding Galileo until 1992. Pope John Paul II established a commission to re-examine the trial. After 13 years of study, the commission concluded that the inquisitors had been mistaken. Galileo had been right. The earth does move. 359 years. That is how long it took. But here is what struck me most as I sat in that archive, reading the trial transcripts by lamplight. The inquisitors were not stupid. They were not ignorant. They knew, or strongly suspected, that Galileo's observations were accurate. The Jesuits had confirmed them. The mathematics supported them. What they feared was not that Galileo was wrong. They feared he was right, because if Scripture could be wrong about the earth standing still, what else might it be wrong about? If human reason and observation could contradict the Church's teaching on cosmology, could it also contradict teachings on morality, on salvation, on the authority of the Church itself? Galileo was not punished for bad science. He was punished for threatening the foundation on which institutional power rested, and the Church chose power over truth, silenced the man who had seen farther than anyone before him, and locked the evidence in an archive. where it would wait 3.5 centuries for acknowledgement. I touched the page where Galileo had written, "How to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." His handwriting slanted right, leaning toward a truth he could not yet speak aloud. The church did not fear that Galileo was wrong. It feared he was right. And that fear, that choice to suppress rather than engage, to punish rather than investigate, is a pattern that repeats throughout the files I found in those locked rooms. But science was not the only truth the Vatican feared. There were older truths, buried deeper, written in languages the faithful were never meant to read. In December of 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi. When his shovel struck something hard, he uncovered a sealed jar, about 3 feet tall, made of red earthenware. For a moment, he hesitated to break it open. Local superstition held that such jars might contain jinn, spirits that could bring either fortune or disaster. He smashed the jar anyway. Inside were 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus, written in Coptic, an ancient Egyptian language. The books contained 52 separate texts, most of which had been lost to history for over 1,600 years. Among them were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Truth. These were not the Gospels you learned about in Sunday school. These were something else entirely. What Muhammad Ali had found, quite by accident, was a library that early Christians had buried sometime in the 4th century, likely to protect it from destruction during a period when the church was systematically hunting down and burning books it deemed heretical. But here is what most people do not know. The Vatican had been aware of texts like these long before 1945, and in the deepest sections of the secret archives, I found evidence that the church had not simply known about them. It had possessed copies of some of them and chosen, deliberately, to keep them hidden. The file was labelled Evangelia Apocrypha, Documenta non authenticata, Apocryphal Gospels, unauthenticated documents. The folder was thick, the pages brittle, some of them fragments glued to newer backing paper to prevent further decay. The earliest entries were dated to the late 17th century, but marginal notes suggested the materials themselves were far older. One fragment, catalogued as Fragmentum Mariae, dated to the 3rd century, contained text nearly identical to portions of the Gospel of Mary discovered at Nag Hammadi. But this Vatican fragment predated that discovery by over 200 years. Someone in the church had known these texts existed. Someone had collected them, catalogued them, and filed them away with a notation that chilled me when I read it. Heresis Manifestae. Why? To understand what made these Gospels dangerous, you have to understand what they said, and more importantly, who they elevated. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene portrays her not as a repentant prostitute, not as a minor follower weeping at the tomb, but as Jesus' closest disciple, the one he loved most, the one to whom he revealed teachings he did not share with the 12 male apostles. In the text, after Jesus' death, Mary tells the other disciples about a vision she received. Peter becomes furious. He cannot accept that Jesus would reveal mysteries to a woman that he did not reveal to men. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Peter demands. Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Levi, another disciple, rebukes Peter. If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Saviour knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. The Gospel of Mary was a threat because it challenged the apostolic succession. The idea that authority in the church descended from Peter through an unbroken line of male bishops and popes. If Mary Magdalene had been Jesus' primary confidant, if she had received teachings the others did not, then the foundation on which church hierarchy was built became unstable. And so, in the year 591, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily in which he conflated 3 separate women mentioned in the Gospels: Mary Magdalene, the devoted follower, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet, described in Luke's Gospel as a woman of the city, which the church interpreted to mean a prostitute. Gregory declared them all to be the same person. Mary Magdalene, he told the faithful, was a prostitute whom Jesus had saved from her sins. There is no biblical evidence for this claim. None. but Gregory's sermon became official church teaching, repeated for over 1400 years, shaping how billions of Christians understood one of the most important figures in early Christianity. In the Vatican Archives, I found a document dated 1663, part of the preparations for revising the Roman Martyrology, the official catalogue of saints. A committee of scholars noted that the conflation of the three Marys lacked scriptural foundation and recommended separating them. The recommendation was rejected. The marginal note, written by a cardinal whose name I could not decipher, read simply, Traditio servanda. The tradition must be preserved. It was not until 1969, nearly 400 years later, that the Vatican finally, quietly, separated the three Marys in its liturgical calendar. And not until 2016 that Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to the same level as the Apostles, officially recognizing her as the Apostle to the Apostles. 1400 years to correct a lie. 1400 years during which women were taught that even the greatest among them had been prostitutes saved by male grace rather than disciples chosen for their faith. But the suppression of Mary Magdalene was only one piece of a much larger pattern. In the year 325, the Roman Emperor Constantine, who had recently converted to Christianity, convened a council of bishops in the city of Nicaea. The purpose was to settle disputes that were fracturing the young church. Arguments over the nature of Christ, the date of Easter, the structure of church governance, but perhaps most significantly, the council addressed which texts should be considered scripture and which should be rejected. The decision was not made by divine revelation. It was made by committee. I found minutes from the Council of Nicaea in a leather folder so old the binding had turned to powder. The Latin was dense, abbreviated, difficult to parse, but the substance was clear. Multiple bishops argued for including texts that did not make it into the final canon. The Gospel of Thomas was debated. Some bishops felt its sayings were authentic, that it preserved teachings of Jesus not found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Others objected. Thomas contained no narrative of the crucifixion, no resurrection story. It was a collection of sayings, wisdom teachings, some of which seemed to contradict the theology the bishops were trying to standardize. One saying in particular caused controversy. Saying 114 reads, Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her, in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." To modern readers, this passage is deeply troubling. It seems misogynistic, bizarre, incomprehensible. But to early Gnostic Christians, it had a specific theological meaning. Male and female were symbolic categories, representing spiritual states, not biological sexes. To become male meant to transcend the material world, to achieve spiritual wholeness. But the bishops at Nicaea did not interpret it that way. They saw a text that was confusing, that required esoteric knowledge to understand, that elevated secret teachings over the simple gospel message they wanted to spread across the empire. The Gospel of Thomas was rejected, not because it was proven false, but because it was inconvenient. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John became the four canonical Gospels. And the Christians who continued to use these other texts, who believed in a more mystical, knowledge-based path to salvation, were hunted down. Their books were burned. Their leaders were executed. By the end of the 4th century, Gnostic Christianity had been almost entirely eradicated. Almost. The texts buried at Nag Hammadi survived because someone, perhaps a monk, who saw the burning coming, hid them in a jar and sealed it, hoping, perhaps, that one day the world would be ready to read them again. In the Vatican Archives, I found a catalogue dated 1738, listing confiscated books seized from a monastery in France. Among them, Evangelium Secundum Thomam, Copia Fragmentaria, a fragmentary copy of the Gospel according to Thomas. The notation beside it read, Destructum per ignem, destroyed by fire. But not all copies were destroyed. I saw one with my own eyes, shelved in a section accessible only to a handful of archivists. The text was incomplete, perhaps a third of the full Gospel, written in Greek on vellum, that had been repaired multiple times over the centuries. It was kept, I believe, not for study, but as evidence, proof that the Church had encountered these heresies and defeated them. Yet the existence of that fragment raises a question I could never answer. If the Vatican possessed a copy of the Gospel of Thomas centuries before the Nag Hammadi discovery, what else did they have? What other texts, what other voices from early Christianity remain locked in vaults we have not yet been allowed to see? The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 near Qumran, added another layer to this story. Among those scrolls were texts that predated Christianity, documents from a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who lived ascetic lives in the desert, practiced ritual bathing, shared communal meals, and believed they were preparing for the end times. Scholars noticed immediately that some of the practices and beliefs of the Essenes resembled those attributed to Jesus and the early Christian community. Some proposed that Jesus might have been influenced by the Essenes, that Christianity grew out of this Jewish mystical tradition rather than appearing fully formed as a divine revelation. The Vatican had early access to the Dead Sea Scrolls through Catholic scholars who were part of the original translation team, and for decades, those scholars controlled access to the texts, delaying publication, restricting who could study them. Why the delay? Officially, the scrolls were fragile, the translation work painstaking, but critics argued that the Catholic scholars were deliberately suppressing materials that challenged traditional Christian narratives. It was not until the 1990s, after international pressure and accusations of academic misconduct, that the full corpus of the Dead Sea Scrolls was finally made public. Among the materials I found in the Vatican archives was correspondence between the Church and the scholars working on the scrolls. In one letter from 1954, a priest warned the Vatican that certain fragments suggested Jesus' teachings were not unique, that they paralleled Essene theology. The reply, written by a cardinal, was brief. Minimize connections. The instruction was clear. Shape the narrative. Control the interpretation. Ensure that Christianity remains special, divinely inspired, not merely another branch of Jewish mysticism. But perhaps the most painful discovery I made was a directive from 1612, issued by Pope Paul V during the reorganization of the Secret Archives. It instructed archivists to catalogue any texts claiming to be Gospels or apostolic writings but not recognized by the Church. The directive concluded with this instruction: these texts are to be preserved as evidence of heresy, not destroyed. Destruction invites suspicion. Preservation under seal demonstrates the Church's confidence that truth will prevail over falsehood. In other words, keep the evidence locked away. Let future generations know these texts existed, but never let them read the texts themselves. Trust that secrecy, maintained long enough, becomes indistinguishable from non-existence. I think about that phrase often. Preservation under seal demonstrates confidence. But confidence in what? In truth, or in the power of institutional authority to define truth, to decide what can be known, to control the story of its own origins? The Church, the Christianity taught in cathedrals and Sunday schools, is the version that survived. But survival does not equal truth. It only means that one group had more power than the others. The ability to burn books, to excommunicate dissenters, to write history. The Christians who believed Mary Magdalene was an apostle, who read the Gospel of Thomas, who sought salvation through knowledge rather than faith alone, they lost. Their books were buried, their names forgotten, but their questions remain, and in a jar sealed 1600 years ago, in fragments catalogued and hidden in Vatican vaults, in the margins of council minutes where bishops argued over which God to believe in, those questions wait. What if the story you were told was incomplete? What if the voices that were silenced had something to say that mattered? What if the Bible you hold in your hands is not the eternal word of God, but the edited compromise of men who chose power over mystery? I held a fragment that mentioned Mary as the one Jesus loved most. The edges were burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it but could not finish. There were more Christianities than we were taught. The one that survived was not the truest. It was simply the most powerful. And power, I have learned, writes history in ink that does not fade. But truth, buried deep enough, waits patiently in the dark for the day when someone finally dares to open the jar. The body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London on the morning of June 18, 1982. Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks, was suspended from the scaffolding under the bridge, a rope around his neck, his pockets weighted with bricks, and $5,000 in cash, distributed across 3 different currencies. His briefcase was missing. So were the documents he had reportedly been carrying when he fled Italy days earlier. The initial verdict was suicide. A man destroyed by the collapse of his financial empire, choosing to end his life in a foreign city where no one knew his name. But the location troubled investigators. Blackfriars. In Italian, Frati Neri. Blackfriars, the same name given to Dominican monks who wore black robes. Calvi's Masonic Lodge, the infamous Propaganda Do, used symbolic murders as warnings. A banker hung beneath a bridge named for monks, his pockets filled with money and stones, was not suicide. In 2002, after a second inquest reviewed the forensic evidence, the verdict was changed to murder. But by then, most of the men who might have ordered it were dead, protected by time, or shielded by the same institution that had made Calvi's crimes possible in the first place. The Vatican. People think of the Vatican as a spiritual entity, a place of prayer and contemplation. But it is also a sovereign nation with its own bank, the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for Works of Religion, known more commonly by its Italian acronym, IOR. Founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII during the darkest years of World War II, the IOR was designed to manage the Holy See's finances, to handle donations from the faithful, to fund the Church's charitable and missionary work across the globe. Noble purposes, documented in official histories. But the Vatican Bank operates under unique conditions. It is not subject to Italian banking regulations. It is not overseen by the European Central Bank. It exists within the sovereign territory of Vatican City, a nation of 110 acres, with a population smaller than most universities. And it answers only to the Pope. That isolation, that freedom from external oversight, made the IOR attractive to people who needed money, moved quietly across borders. People who could not afford questions. And in the 1970s and early 80s, the Vatican Bank became something its founders never publicly intended, a laundromat for dirty money. I found the files in a section of the archive that had been sealed until 2013, when Pope Francis ordered a comprehensive investigation into the IOR's past. The folder was labelled Transazioni Riservate, 78 a 82, Confidential Transactions, 78 to 82. Inside were ledgers, photocopies of deposit slips, coded correspondence between Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American priest who ran the Vatican Bank, and his associates in Milan, Panama, and Nassau. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars moving through shell companies with names that meant nothing, registered in countries chosen specifically for their banking secrecy laws. The transfers were described in language designed to obscure. Charitable contributions, loans for ecclesiastical purposes. But one entry, dated November 1980, broke the pattern. Archbishop M. approves. No further documentation required. Archbishop M. Paul Marcinkus, a 6'3" former bodyguard to Pope Paul VI, a man who spoke Italian with a Chicago accent, who loved golf and cigars, and reportedly once told a critic, "You cannot run the church on Hail Marys." Marcinkus understood that the Vatican needed money to function, that maintaining a global institution required resources, and that sometimes those resources came from sources that would not withstand scrutiny. He built relationships with Italian financiers, with offshore bankers, with men whose wealth came from construction contracts, awarded through political favours, from currency speculation, from businesses that operated in the spaces where legality blurred. One of those men was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian banker who had ties to the mafia, to the CIA, to the Masonic Lodge Propaganda Do. Sindona helped the Vatican invest its money throughout the 1960s and early 70s, producing impressive returns through methods the Vatican chose not to examine too closely. In 1974, Sindona's empire collapsed when his Franklin National Bank failed in what was then the largest banking collapse in American history. Investigators discovered fraud, embezzlement, and connections to organized crime. Sindona fled to the United States, was eventually extradited to Italy, convicted of fraud and of ordering the murder of a lawyer investigating his crimes, and died in prison in 1986 after drinking coffee laced with cyanide. The official story was suicide. Sindona's family insisted it was murder. Either way, he was dead, and dead men do not testify. But before Sindona fell, he had introduced Marcinkus to Roberto Calvi. Calvi was different from Sindona, quieter, more cautious, deeply devout. He attended Mass regularly, carried a rosary, and seemed to genuinely believe he was serving God's work by managing the Vatican's money. He ran Banco Ambrosiano, a Catholic bank in Milan, and through a complex network of offshore companies, he made the Vatican Bank one of Ambrosiano's largest shareholders. The relationship was profitable for both sides. Calvi gained the credibility and protection that came from association with the Holy See. The Vatican gained access to sophisticated financial instruments that multiplied its wealth while keeping the transactions hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy. But some of that money, investigators would later discover, was being funneled to places that had nothing to do with missionary work. I found a memorandum dated August 1981, addressed to Marcinkus from an Italian banker whose name had been redacted. The memo detailed a transfer of funds, approximately $15 million, routed through the Vatican Bank to accounts controlled by anti-communist forces in Poland. This was during the Solidarity movement, when Polish workers were rising against the Soviet-backed government, and the Vatican, under Pope John Paul II, a Polish pope who despised communism, was quietly supporting the resistance. Was this illegal? Not under Vatican law. Was it moral? That depends on whether you believe funding resistance to totalitarian regimes justifies using a religious institution's banking apparatus for political purposes. But the Polish funds were not the only secret transactions. Other money went to the Contras in Nicaragua, to right-wing political parties in Italy, to purposes that remain unclear because the documentation was incomplete, shredded, or never created in the first place. And then there was the mafia. Calvi was laundering money for Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian organized crime syndicate that controlled construction, drug trafficking, and political corruption across southern Italy. The money moved through Banco Ambrosiano, through offshore shells in Panama and the Bahamas, through accounts at the Vatican Bank that Marcinkus either did not scrutinize or chose not to question. In June 1982, it all collapsed. Italian authorities began investigating Banco Ambrosiano's offshore dealings. Calvi was convicted of illegal currency exportation and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Though he remained free pending appeal, the bank's stock price collapsed, depositors panicked, and on June 10, 1982, Calvi disappeared from his apartment in Rome. He fled to Austria, then to London, travelling under a false passport, meeting with associates whose identities remained disputed. According to some accounts, he was trying to negotiate a deal to secure promises of protection in exchange for his silence about who had benefited from his schemes. According to others, he was simply running, knowing that the people he had worked with, both in the Vatican and in the Mafia, could not afford to let him talk. On June 17th, he checked into a modest hotel in Chelsea under a false name. Sometime that night, or early the following morning, he left the hotel. Hours later, he was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Blackfriars. Calvi had been a member of Propaganda Due, a secret Masonic lodge that included politicians, military officers, intelligence agents, and financiers. The lodge used rituals and symbols drawn from Masonic tradition, and one of their punishments for betrayal was said to involve hanging, weighted with stones, beneath a bridge. Calvi's family insisted he had been murdered. They pointed to the forensic evidence, the lack of riverbank mud on his shoes, the improbability that a 62-year-old man could have climbed the scaffolding in the dark and rigged the rope himself. In 2005, 5 defendants, including a mafia boss and several associates, were tried for Calvi's murder. All were acquitted for lack of evidence. The investigation had taken too long. Witnesses had died or recanted. The physical evidence had degraded, and the most important question, who ordered the killing, was never answered. But the financial fallout answered some questions the murderers could not suppress. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, auditors discovered it was missing $1.3 billion. The money had been funneled through a network of offshore companies that the Vatican Bank held shares in. Companies with names like Manic SA and Bellatrix SA. Registered in Panama, used for transactions that left no clear trail. The Vatican initially denied responsibility, claiming it had been deceived by Calvi, that Marcinkus had acted in good faith, that the Holy See was as much a victim as anyone. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 1984, facing lawsuits from Banco Ambrosiano's creditors, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million in settlement without admitting legal guilt but acknowledging, in the carefully worded phrase, moral involvement. Moral involvement, not complicity, not responsibility, just a recognition that something had gone wrong and the Vatican's name had been attached to it. Marcinkus was never charged with a crime. Italian prosecutors issued warrants for his arrest on charges of fraud and complicity in the bank's collapse. But Marcinkus remained within Vatican City, protected by its sovereign immunity. He stayed there until 1990, when the scandal had quieted and he was quietly reassigned to a parish in Arizona. He died in 2006, having never publicly explained his role in the affair, never admitted wrongdoing, never faced trial. I found one more document that haunted me long after I left the archives. It was dated September 1982, just 3 months after Calvi's death, part of an internal Vatican review of the IOR's practices. The review recommended greater transparency, independent audits, and the closure of accounts that could not be adequately documented. In the margin, someone, I do not know who, had written in Italian, raccomandazioni, notate, implementazione rinviata, recommendations noted, implementation postponed. The recommendations were not implemented in 1982, nor in 1990. The Vatican Bank continued to operate in secrecy, continued to accept deposits from sources it did not adequately investigate, continued to resist external oversight. It was not until 2010, when Italian authorities seized 23 million euros from a Vatican bank account suspected of money laundering, that the pressure became impossible to ignore. Then, in 2012, Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler leaked thousands of confidential documents to the press, documents that revealed corruption, cronyism, and financial mismanagement at the highest levels of the Vatican bureaucracy. The scandal was called VatiLeaks. It exposed infighting among cardinals, allegations of blackmail, and a culture of secrecy that protected wrongdoing rather than punishing it. Some believe the pressure from these revelations contributed to Benedict's decision to resign in 2013, the first pope to voluntarily step down in nearly 600 years. His successor, Pope Francis, moved quickly. He established a commission to investigate the IOR, hired international auditors, closed thousands of suspicious accounts, and in 2014 issued new regulations requiring the Vatican Bank to comply with international anti-money laundering standards. Progress, reform, accountability. But I remember the ledger I held in my hands, the entries listing millions moved with a single signature, no questions asked, no documentation required. I remember the note in the margin approving $25 million for an unspecified purpose. I remember Archbishop Marcinkus, protected by sovereign immunity, dying peacefully in Arizona without ever answering for what he had done or allowed to be done in God's name. And I remember Roberto Calvi, hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets full of bricks and money, a message delivered to anyone who might think about talking. The Vatican Bank still exists. It manages approximately $8 billion in assets. It operates under stricter regulations now, subject to audits, monitored by international authorities. The days of unchecked secrecy are supposed to be over, but the files I read, the transactions I traced, the patterns of money moving through shell companies while men in clerical robes looked the other way, those are not ancient history. They happened within living memory. Some of the cardinals who were in power then are still alive. Some of the accounts that were closed only in the last decade. The ledger did not smell of incense. It smelled of ink and fear. And as I turned its pages, I understood something I had been avoiding. The Vatican does not merely guard spiritual mysteries. It guards money. And where there is money without oversight, there is corruption. Where there is corruption protected by secrecy, there is violence. And where violence serves to maintain silence, truth becomes a casualty no amount of prayer can resurrect. The document was signed by a pope, not just any document. A papal bull issued on May 8, 1493, barely a year after Christopher Columbus had returned from his first voyage across the Atlantic. Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia, infamous even by the standards of Renaissance corruption, had divided the entire non-Christian world between two Catholic kingdoms, Spain and Portugal. The bull was called Inter Caetera, and its language was precise, legal, absolute. It granted to the Spanish crown all islands and mainlands, found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered in the Western Ocean, along with full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction over them. The justification was simple. These lands were inhabited by people who do not worship idols, but are not yet instructed in the faith. Therefore, they could be claimed, colonized, converted. Their consent was irrelevant. Their existing societies, their governance, their spiritual traditions, all of it was rendered invisible by a single theological assumption. If you were not Christian, you had no rights that Christians were bound to respect. This doctrine became known as the doctrine of discovery, and it was not merely a historical curiosity, a relic of a less enlightened age. It was cited in legal cases well into the 20th century, used by courts in the United States, Canada, and Australia to justify the seizure of indigenous lands. It was the foundation upon which European colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia was built, and it was written, blessed, and enforced by the Catholic Church. I found the file in a section labeled Missiones Novi Mundi, Missions of the New World. Inside were letters, reports, and testimonies sent from Jesuit, Franciscan, and Dominican missionaries to the Vatican over the course of 3 centuries. Some described the work of conversion, the baptisms, the construction of churches in places where no churches had stood before, but others described something darker. One letter, dated May 15th, 42, was written by a Spanish Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas. He had spent years in the Caribbean and Central America, witnessing what the conquistadors, sanctioned by papal authority, were doing to the native populations. His account, which he sent to the Vatican and later published as a short account of the destruction of the Indies, was graphic in its detail. Mass killings of unarmed villagers, torture used not for interrogation but for entertainment, entire populations enslaved, worked to death in mines and plantations, women and children burned alive, communities destroyed so completely that within decades, populations that had numbered in the millions were reduced to thousands. Las Casas wrote, "They attacked the towns and spared neither children nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor those in child labour, all of whom they ran through the body and lacerated as though they were assaulting so many lambs herded into their sheepfold." He sent a copy to Pope Paul III. The Vatican's response, dated October 2nd, 1543, acknowledged receipt. "We have received your account with concern for the souls of the faithful and the salvation of the innocents." But the letter did not condemn the violence. It did not order the conquistadors to stop. It did not revoke the bulls that had authorized the conquest in the first place. Instead, it expressed concern and then proceeded to discuss matters of church administration in the colonies, the appointment of bishops, the construction of cathedrals. Las Casas had documented genocide. The Vatican had filed it under administrative correspondence. The problem, I came to understand, was not ignorance. The Vatican knew. They received detailed reports from missionaries describing atrocities, but Spain was the Church's most powerful military ally. The sword that had driven Muslims out of Iberia, the force that was spreading Catholicism across the globe. To condemn Spain's actions in the New World would be to jeopardize that alliance. So the Vatican chose silence. In 1513, the Spanish crown created a legal document called the Requerimiento. The requirement. It was to be read aloud to indigenous peoples before any act of conquest. The document, written in Spanish, a language the listeners could not understand, informed them that God had created the world, that the Pope was God's representative on earth, that the Pope had granted these lands to the King of Spain, and that they must immediately submit to Spanish rule and convert to Christianity. If they refused, the Requerimiento stated, "We shall take you and your wives and children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them, as their highnesses may command. And we shall take your goods, and do you all the mischief and damage that we can. As to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him." This was not a negotiation. It was a formality designed to provide legal cover for violence that had already been decided upon. And the Vatican approved it. I found a copy of the Requerimiento in the archives, annotated in Latin by a church official who had reviewed it in 1514. His note read, "Formula iuridica apta ad conversionem vel subjectionem," a legal formula suitable for conversion or subjection. Conversion or subjection. The soul or the body. Either way, submission. The mission system that spread across California, the American Southwest, and Latin America between the 16th and 19th centuries was presented as a charitable enterprise. Franciscan friars, led by figures like Junipero Serra, established compounds where indigenous people could be taught Christianity, agriculture, European trades. But the missions were also labor camps. Indigenous people were brought to the missions, sometimes willingly, often by force. Once there, they were forbidden to leave. They were required to work, to attend Mass, to abandon their languages, their spiritual practices, their ways of life. Discipline was enforced through corporal punishment. Shackles were used. Isolation cells. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped quarters. Measles, smallpox, influenza, illnesses the indigenous populations had no immunity against. Thousands died. The missions kept records, burial registers, that documented the deaths but offered no explanation beyond the will of God. I found a letter from Junipero Serra, written in 1769, discussing resistance among the Kumeyaay people in what is now San Diego. "The Indians resist baptism," he wrote. "We must be firm in our resolve to bring them to Christ, even if they do not yet understand the salvation we offer." Firm. A word that covered a multitude of coercions. In 2015, Pope Francis canonized Junipero Serra as a saint, declaring him a model of evangelization. Indigenous groups across California protested. They called Serra a colonizer, a man who had enabled cultural genocide, who had presided over a system that destroyed their ancestors' ways of life. The Vatican's response was that Serra was a man of his time, that he had worked within the structures available to him, that his intentions had been to save souls. Intentions, as though good intentions could absolve the destruction they enabled. But the mission system was not the worst of what the Church facilitated. Between the 1800s and the 1990s, the Catholic Church operated residential schools for Indigenous children in Canada, the United States, and Australia. The stated purpose was education and assimilation. The reality was cultural annihilation. Children, some as young as 4 years old, were forcibly removed from their families and placed in church-run institutions. Forbidden to practice their traditions, punished, often brutally, for any expression of their indigenous identity. The stated goal, articulated clearly by government and church officials, was to kill the Indian, save the man. Physical abuse was widespread. Sexual abuse was rampant. Medical care was neglected. Thousands of children died from disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. They were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, their deaths often not reported to their families. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys at former residential school sites in Canada began uncovering these graves. Hundreds of children, then thousands, small bodies buried without ceremony, without record, without acknowledgement. The Vatican had funded these schools. Catholic orders, the Oblates, the Jesuits, the Sisters of Charity, had staffed them. Priests and nuns had enforced the rules, administered the punishments, presided over the deaths. In 2022, Pope Francis travelled to Canada and issued an apology. He called the residential school system a disastrous error and asked for forgiveness. It was the first time a pope had apologized on Canadian soil for the Church's role in cultural genocide, but the apology came only after the graves were found. only after international pressure made silence impossible. And even then, the Church did not offer financial reparations, did not return the sacred objects held in Vatican museums, objects taken from the cultures the Church had tried to destroy, did not open its archives fully to allow survivors and descendants to understand the full scope of what had been done in God's name. I found a report dated 1887, sent from a residential school in Alberta to the Vatican. It detailed the school's operations, the number of children enrolled, the curriculum, the conversions achieved. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, it noted that 42 children had died that year, mostly from tuberculosis. There was no expression of grief, no questioning of whether the conditions that allowed tuberculosis to spread so easily might be worth examining. Just a notation. 42 deaths. Filed and forgotten. The most difficult document I found was a letter dated 1720 from a Jesuit plantation in Maryland. The Jesuits owned enslaved people. This is not a secret. It has been documented by historians, but seeing the evidence in the Church's own records, written in the calm administrative language of property management, was different. The letter listed the names of 3 individuals, described as souls purchased for mission labor. Souls, not people, not men or women with families, with histories, with inner lives. Souls, property with an eternal dimension. The Church, which preached the equality of all people before God, which claimed to oppose the slave trade, owned human beings, bought them, sold them, bred them, used their labor to fund missionary work, to build churches, to spread the gospel. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a bull called Dum Diversus, authorizing the King of Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever and other enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Perpetual slavery. Authorized by a pope, the Church did not formally condemn the slave trade until the 19th century, and even then, the condemnation came slowly, reluctantly, long after abolition movements led by secular forces had made the practice untenable. In 2023, the Vatican issued a statement repudiating the doctrine of discovery. The statement acknowledged that the papal bulls of the 15th and 16th centuries had been used to justify colonization and the subjugation of indigenous peoples, and it declared that these bulls did not reflect the Church's current teaching. Repudiation, not apology, not reparation, just a recognition that the past, uncomfortable and indefensible, could be disowned without accepting responsibility for its consequences. I read the letter from the Taino chief that was never answered. I read reports of villages burned, of languages lost, of children buried in unmarked graves. I read the justifications, the theological arguments that made it all permissible, the doctrine that said, if you were not Christian, you were not fully human, and your land, your body, your children, all of it could be taken in the name of salvation. And I understood that the Vatican's greatest crime was not what it did, but what it sanctioned others to do, and then filed away as though documentation alone could substitute for justice. The ink on these pages was made from plants stolen from stolen land, written by hands that blessed the swords that cut down those who resisted, and the files remain. Sealed, organized, waiting for a time when the Church believes the world is ready to forgive what it has never fully confessed. The letter had no salutation. It began, simply, with a date, August 7th, 1942, and beneath that, a single line in handwritten German that had been translated into Italian and filed in a folder marked Relazioni Segrete, Germania, Secret Reports, Germany. We do not ask for a public intervention. We only ask that you affirm that God is not silent. It was signed by a rabbi whose name I could not pronounce, from a town in Slovakia that no longer exists, not because the town was destroyed by bombs or fire, but because everyone who lived there was taken away. The trains left in autumn of 1942, just weeks after this letter was written. They went east, to a place the Germans called Auschwitz. The letter arrived at the Vatican on August 23rd. A clerk stamped it, catalogued it, and forwarded it to the Secretariat of State. the department responsible for the church's diplomatic relations. In the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Risposta in sospeso." Response pending. There was no response in the file. No draft, no copy, no indication that anyone had ever written back to tell that rabbi whether God was silent or not. 60 years later, in March of 2020, the Vatican opened the archives of Pope Pius XII, the man who led the Catholic Church from 1939 to 1958 through the entirety of World War II and the Holocaust. Historians had been demanding access for decades. Jewish organizations had called Pius Hitler's Pope, accusing him of complicity through silence, of watching millions die and saying nothing. The Vatican had resisted, citing the traditional 70-year embargo on sensitive documents. But under pressure, under the weight of questions that would not fade, Pope Francis finally authorized the release. I was among the first to enter that newly opened section. The folders filled an entire wall, floor to ceiling, organized by year, by region, by topic. Correspondence with German bishops, reports from papal nuncios stationed across occupied Europe, internal memos debating how or whether the church should respond to what was happening to the Jews. What I found was not a simple story of good or evil. It was something more painful, a record of moral calculation, of men choosing between impossible options, of silence that was sometimes cowardice and sometimes strategy, and of the terrible truth that even now, 80 years later, we cannot say with certainty which was which. The story begins before the war. In 1933, just months after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. On July 20th of that year, the Vatican signed a concordat with the Nazi regime, a treaty. The Church agreed to stay out of German politics, to disband Catholic political parties and labor unions. In exchange, Hitler's government guaranteed the Church's rights, protected Catholic schools, allowed religious education, permitted the appointment of bishops. The man who negotiated the concordat on behalf of the Vatican was Eugenio Pacelli, the Cardinal Secretary of State. Critics have argued ever since that the concordat legitimized Hitler, gave him international credibility at a moment when the Nazi regime was still fragile, still vulnerable to internal and external pressure. The Vatican has countered that the concordat was a pragmatic necessity, that it protected German Catholics at a time when the Church had no other leverage. Both things can be true. I found drafts of the concordat in the archives, multiple versions with handwritten edits, passages crossed out, language softened. In one early draft, the Vatican had demanded explicit protections for Catholics of Jewish ancestry, converts who had been baptized but were still considered racially Jewish under Nazi law. That clause was removed in the final version, not by the Nazis, but by Vatican negotiators who decided it was too controversial, that insisting on it might derail the entire agreement. The compromise was filed. The converts were not protected, and within a decade, many of them would be deported to camps alongside Jews who had never set foot in a church. In 1938, Pope Pius XI, Pacelli's predecessor, commissioned an encyclical titled Humani Generis Unitas, the unity of the human race. It was intended to be a strong condemnation of racism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. The draft, written by Jesuits working in secret, stated clearly, the so-called presuppositions of racism are false. Anti-Semitism is unacceptable. Pius XI died on February 10, 1939, before the encyclical could be published. His successor, Pius XII, read the draft and chose not to release it. He filed it away, where it remained unseen until historians uncovered it in the Vatican archives in 1995. Why suppress it? The official explanation is that Pius XII feared it would provoke Nazi retaliation against Catholics in Germany and occupied territories. That speaking out would endanger more lives than it would save. Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply lacked the courage. I cannot know. What I know is that the draft existed, that it said what needed to be said, and that the man with the power to say it chose silence instead. On Christmas Eve, 1942, Pius XII delivered his annual radio address to the world. The Einsatzgruppen had already killed over 1 million people in mass shootings across Eastern Europe. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were operating at capacity. Trains were arriving daily, packed with people who had hours to live. The Vatican knew. Reports from bishops, from nuncios, from Catholic aid workers had been arriving for months, describing deportations, mass killings, disappearances. The information was fragmentary, incomplete, but it was enough to understand that something unprecedented was happening. In his Christmas address, Pius spoke of the suffering caused by the war. He called for peace, for respect, for human dignity, and then he said this: "Humanity owes that vow to the hundreds of thousands who, without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, are marked down for death or progressive extinction." Hundreds of thousands, nationality or race. He never said Jews. He never said Nazis. He spoke in generalities, in abstractions, in language so vague it could mean anything or nothing. Jewish leaders at the time understood exactly what he was doing. One rabbi wrote, "The Pope has spoken, and yet he has said nothing." I found a folder labelled Discorsi non pronunciati, speeches not delivered. Inside were 3 drafts of papal addresses written during the war years that were never given. One, dated December 24th, 1942, the same day as the vague radio address, was titled Sai cut stelle in nocte, like stars in the night. It began, "We grieve for the millions of innocents destroyed, whether for their race, their faith, or their language. We cannot remain silent while the image of God is defiled in his children." The language was direct, specific, moral. Clipped to the draft was a note, unsigned, written in the same hand as many of the marginal annotations I had seen throughout the files. "Would endanger German parishes. Must wait." The draft was filed. The waiting continued. The millions died, but the Vatican was not entirely silent. And this is where the story becomes impossibly complicated. In a folder marked Operazioni di Soccorso, rescue operations, I found hundreds of documents detailing efforts to hide Jews in monasteries, convents, and church properties across Rome and beyond. The files included lists of names, safe houses, forged identity documents, correspondence between priests coordinating the network. One entry, dated October 1943, stated, "Santa Brigida Convent has hidden over 200 Jews disguised as pilgrims. The abbess accepts personal responsibility if discovered." Another, from a priest in Florence, reported, "We have baptized 73 Jewish children with the understanding that the baptisms will be annulled after the danger passes. Their families are sheltered in the seminary." Estimates suggest that the Vatican's network saved between 4,000 and 7,000 Jews in Rome alone. Thousands more across Europe, hidden in church properties, given false papers, smuggled to safety. All of this done quietly, secretly, without public acknowledgement. Why in secret? The official explanation is that publicity would have endangered both the rescuers and the rescued. That if the Vatican had announced it was hiding Jews, the Nazis would have raided every church, every monastery, every convent in occupied territory. And there is evidence for this. In July 1942, Dutch Catholic bishops issued a public pastoral letter condemning the deportation of Jews. The letter was read from every Catholic pulpit in the Netherlands on July 26th. The Nazi response was immediate and brutal. They arrested every Catholic convert of Jewish ancestry they could find, including Edith Stein, a Carmelite nun and philosopher. She was deported to Auschwitz and murdered in the gas chambers on August 9th. After the Dutch bishops spoke, the Nazis killed more people, not fewer. Pius XII knew this, and it paralysed him. I found a letter from Angelo Roncalli, the papal nuncio in Istanbul who would later become Pope John XXIII. Written in November 1944, it read, "If we speak, they will kill more. If we remain silent, our conscience will die. There is no choice that does not stain us." And beneath it, a response from the Vatican, unsigned. "To choose between voice and life. No one is holy enough to choose rightly." The archive contains thousands of letters from Jewish families, from refugee organizations, from desperate people begging the Vatican to intervene, to speak, to do something visible that might slow the machinery of murder. One letter, dated May 1943, came from a group of Jewish mothers in Warsaw. It was written in Yiddish, translated into Latin by a Polish priest. "Our children are being taken. We have heard the Holy Father is a man of God. If he would say one word that this is sin, perhaps some hearts would remember they are human." The margin note read, "Forwarded to His Holiness. No action taken." But in 1943, the Vatican did act. In one specific instance, in October of that year, the Nazis began rounding up Jews in Rome itself, within sight of the Vatican. On October 16th, over 1,000 people were arrested, loaded onto trains at Tiburtina station. The trains were visible from Vatican City. Pius XII did not issue a public protest, but he did send his nephew, Prince Carlo Pacelli, to meet with the German military commandant in Rome. The message was clear. If the deportations continued, the Pope might be forced to speak publicly. The deportations from Rome stopped. No more trains left after October 16th. Jews who had already been arrested were murdered, but those who remained, who were hidden in churches and monasteries, were not hunted with the same intensity. Was it enough? No. 1,043 people had already been deported. Only 16 returned. Was it something? Yes, and that is the unbearable truth of this archive. That Pius XII was neither the monster his critics described, nor the saint his defenders claimed. He was a man who made calculations, who weighed the cost of speech against the cost of silence, who saved some and abandoned others, who acted when he felt he could and froze when he feared the consequences. After the war, the Vatican faced a different moral test. Thousands of Nazi war criminals fled Europe, seeking refuge in South America, and some of them received help from Catholic clergy, bishops, priests, officials in Rome who provided false identity papers, letters of recommendation, passage through what became known as the rat lines. I found a file labelled Assistenza Post Bellica, Post-War Assistance. It contained Red Cross travel documents issued with Vatican support, applications for visas submitted on behalf of refugees whose backgrounds were, at best, poorly vetted. One document bore the name Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, responsible for the torture and death of thousands. Another listed Adolf Eichmann, architect of the final solution, who escaped to Argentina using a Vatican-issued laissez-passer. The Church's defense was that they were helping refugees, that in the chaos after the war, it was impossible to verify everyone's identity, that they acted out of Christian charity, not Nazi sympathy. But some of the clergy involved, particularly Bishop Alois Hudal, were openly sympathetic to fascism. Hudal believed that communism was the greater evil, that former Nazis could be redeemed and used in the fight against Soviet expansion. Whether the Vatican leadership knew exactly who was being helped, I cannot say with certainty, but the files suggest willful blindness, a choice not to ask questions when the answers might require difficult decisions. In 2020, after the archives opened, researchers found a memo from 1947. A Vatican official had raised concerns about the rat lines, suggesting that some of those being assisted might be war criminals. The response, from a higher-ranking official, stated, "We provide assistance to souls in need. Their past is between them and God, between them and God." Which meant, in practice, between them and no one. Golda Meir, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel, said in 1958, when Pius XII died, "When fearful martyrdom came to our people in the decade of Nazi terror, the voice of the Pope was raised for the victims." But Albert Einstein, asked about the Church's role during the Holocaust, said, "Only the Church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for suppressing truth. I never had any special interest in the Church before, but now I feel a great affection and admiration because the Church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom." Both statements cannot be entirely true, but both reflect something real, that the Vatican's response to the Holocaust was fractured, contradictory, simultaneously courageous and cowardly, effective and inadequate. I sat in the archive for hours after reading the last file, staring at a page that contained a single sentence in Pius XII's own handwriting. It was undated, written on personal stationery. Perhaps never sent, perhaps only a thought captured in a private moment. I fear history will not forgive silence, but I fear more that speech will kill those I might have saved. He was right to fear both things, and wrong to think he could escape either. I almost missed it. The painting was not displayed. It was stored, wrapped in muslin cloth that had yellowed with age, leaning against a wall in a room that had no windows and smelled of stone and old varnish. The room itself was not marked on any map I had seen of the archive. I found it only because I had gotten lost, turned down a corridor I had not noticed before, and opened a door I thought might lead back to the main hall. Instead, it led here, to a collection the Vatican had decided the world was not ready to see. The label on the cloth read Arte non exhibenda, art not to be exhibited, and beneath that, a single name, Caravaggio. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio. A man who painted saints like criminals and criminals like saints, who used prostitutes as models for the Virgin Mary, who depicted biblical scenes with a brutal realism that made viewers turn away, not from lack of beauty, but from an excess of truth. He was commissioned by churches, by cardinals, by wealthy patrons who wanted their chapels adorned with images of divine grace. And again, his work was rejected. Not because it lacked skill. Caravaggio was one of the greatest painters who ever lived. Too much flesh, too much suffering. The Death of the Virgin, painted in 1606, was rejected by the church that commissioned it. The priest said Mary looked too much like a corpse, swollen, common, undignified. Rumour claimed Caravaggio had used the body of a drowned prostitute, pulled from the Tiber, as his model. Whether true or not, the painting disturbed. It showed death as it actually appears, not as theology prefers to imagine it. The painting was eventually sold and now hangs in the Louvre. But what I found in that room was not the Death of the Virgin. It was something else. A preparatory study, perhaps, or an alternate version. The canvas was smaller, the composition rougher, but the face of Mary was even more explicit. Eyes half open, mouth slack, skin the colour of old wax. And written in the corner, in a curator's hand from some unknown century, Troppo vero per essere santo. Too true to be holy. I unwrapped another canvas. This one was labelled only with a date, 1603. No title, no attribution. But the style was unmistakable. Caravaggio's use of light and shadow, his chiaroscuro, the way darkness did not merely surround his figures but seemed to press against them. The painting showed Mary Magdalene, not weeping, not penitent, not gazing heavenward in spiritual ecstasy. She was looking directly out of the canvas, at me, at anyone who stood before her. Her expression was not one of shame, it was defiance. She was painted as the church had claimed she was, a woman of the streets, but Caravaggio had given her dignity, agency, a face that said, "I am not sorry for what I am, only for what you made me." I understood why this painting had never been displayed. It contradicted the narrative. The church had spent 1400 years teaching that Mary Magdalene had been saved from sin by Jesus, that she represented the redemption available to even the lowest of sinners. This painting suggested something else, that she had not needed saving, that her sin was a fiction imposed on her. There were other works in that room. A sculpture by Bernini, a Pietà that had been rejected because Mary's face showed not serene grief but rage. Her mouth was open as if screaming. Her hands clutched her son's body, not in gentle mourning but in fury at a God who would demand such a sacrifice. There was a fresco fragment, removed from a chapel wall in the 1600s, that depicted the crucifixion with such anatomical precision, every muscle straining, every wound bleeding, that viewers had fainted during Mass. The bishop ordered it covered, then removed, then destroyed. But a portion survived, and it was here. I found sketches by Michelangelo, studies for works that were never completed or were altered before completion. One showed Jonah emerging from the whale not with the serene confidence of a prophet who had been saved, but with the expression of a man who had been devoured and spit out, traumatized, broken. Another sketch, barely more than a few charcoal lines, showed two male figures embracing. No labels, no context. But the intimacy was unmistakable. And beneath it, a note in Latin, destroyed by order of Cardinal Caraffa, 1559, except it had not been destroyed. Someone had kept it, filed it, preserved the evidence of what had been deemed too dangerous to allow. The pattern became clear. The Vatican did not destroy art that challenged its theology. Destruction would be an admission that the art had power, that it posed a threat. Instead, the Church archived it, kept it in rooms like this one, where only a handful of people over the course of centuries would ever see it. Art was suppressed when it insisted that saints were human. That suffering was ugly. That desire existed even in the holy. That doubt, fear, rage, and grief were not obstacles to faith but part of its texture. The Church wanted art that elevated, that made the divine seem distant, perfect, untouchable, art that reminded viewers they were fallen, that heaven was elsewhere, that salvation required submission to those who claimed to hold its keys. But artists like Caravaggio refused. They painted God's mother as a peasant woman who died badly. They painted apostles as rough men with dirty feet and fearful eyes. They painted Jesus not as a remote figure of theological perfection, but as a man who suffered, who bled, who died in agony and perhaps, in his final moments, doubted whether any of it had meaning. That kind of art was dangerous. Not because it denied faith, but because it made faith harder. It stripped away the comfort of certainty and left only the raw encounter between a human being and the terrible, beautiful mystery of existence. I stood before the Magdalene for a long time. The paint was thick, laid on in swift, angry strokes. Caravaggio had not lingered over this work, smoothing and refining. He had painted it quickly, as though he needed to get it out of himself before the vision faded. Her eyes were grey, not the idealized blue or brown of Renaissance convention, but grey, the colour of storm clouds. And there was something in those eyes, a question she was asking without words. Why must I be ashamed? The Church's answer had been clear for 1400 years. Because you are a woman, because you are sexual, because your very existence reminds men that their bodies have desires, that theology has declared sinful. But Caravaggio's answer, painted in oil and shadow, was different. You need not be ashamed. The shame belongs to those who made you a symbol of their fear. I thought about the Sistine Chapel, where millions of tourists pass each year beneath Michelangelo's frescoes. The ceiling was restored in the 1980s and 90s, cleaned of centuries of candle smoke and grime. The restoration revealed colours that were bright, vibrant, almost shocking after so many years of darkness. But some scholars argued that the restoration went too far, that it removed not just dirt but also the final layers of shading Michelangelo had applied, the subtle darkening that gave the figures depth and drama. The Vatican chose brightness over fidelity to the artist's intent, chose the version that would inspire awe over the version that would inspire contemplation. Even in restoration, control. There is a section of the Vatican Library called the Inferno. Not an official name, just what the archivists call it. It contains erotic art from classical antiquity, Greek vases depicting sexual acts, Roman frescoes from Pompeii showing gods in intimate embraces. These are not hidden because they are obscene, but because they are pagan, because they represent a world where desire was not inherently sinful, where the body was celebrated rather than condemned. Scholars can request access, but the requests are rarely granted. The art exists, catalogued and preserved, but kept from view, as though seeing it might remind people that Christianity's sexual ethics were not universal, not eternal, but the product of particular historical anxieties. I found a catalogue from 1738 listing works confiscated from a French monastery. Among them, a painting of Saint Sebastian by an unknown artist. Sebastian is always depicted pierced by arrows, dying for his faith. But this version, according to the catalogue's description, showed him not in noble suffering but in something that resembled ecstasy. The painting was described as indecente and ordered burned, but the catalogue entry had a note, copia preservata per documentazione. A copy. Somewhere in these archives, a copy of that painting still existed. Proof that even in destruction, the Vatican could not quite let go. could not quite surrender the evidence of what it had deemed necessary to suppress. The elderly archivist who had first warned me about opening certain doors once told me something I did not understand until I stood in that room surrounded by hidden paintings. He said, "The church does not fear beauty. It fears beauty that asks questions." Caravaggio's Magdalene asked a question. Bernini's Raging Mary asked a question. Michelangelo's Broken Jonah asked a question. And the church, rather than answer, chose silence, chose darkness, chose rooms without windows, where art could exist but not speak. I wrapped the paintings back in their muslin. I closed the door. I did not mark the location, did not note it in any journal, because I knew that room was not meant to be found, but I carry those images with me. The Magdalene's grey eyes, Mary's open mouth, frozen in a scream that has lasted 400 years, Jonah's trauma, Sebastian's ecstasy, art that was too true to be holy, art that insisted the divine was not separate from the human, but found within it, in all its beauty and ugliness, desire and doubt, rage and tenderness. The Vatican archived that truth. But truth, even in darkness, does not fade. It only waits. The file was thick, bound with red ribbon that had faded to the colour of rust. Miraculous sub-examine. Miracles under examination. Inside were hundreds of cases, each documented with the precision of a legal proceeding. Medical records, witness testimonies, expert opinions from doctors who were not Catholic, who had no institutional reason to believe in divine intervention, and yet could not explain what they had observed. But for every miracle the Church had approved, there were dozens it had rejected. And reading those rejections taught me more about the nature of faith than any approved case ever could. The Church does not want to believe in miracles. That might surprise you. But it is true. Every alleged miracle is treated with suspicion, investigated with skepticism, subjected to scrutiny that would satisfy a scientific journal, because the Church understands something that believers often do not. False miracles are more dangerous than no miracles at all. They invite mockery. They undermine credibility. They turn faith into spectacle. So the bar for approval is extraordinarily high. And most claims never clear it. I opened the file on Lourdes first. In 1858, a 14-year-old girl named Bernadette Suberus claimed she had seen the Virgin Mary in a grotto near her village in southern France. Mary appeared to her 18 times, spoke to her in the local dialect, and directed her to a spring, whose water, Mary said, had healing properties. Since then, over 200 million people have visited Lourdes. Thousands have claimed to be healed by the water. Cancers vanished, paralysis reversed, blindness cured. The sick arrived on stretchers and walked away whole. The Lourdes Medical Bureau was established to investigate these claims. It is staffed by doctors, many of them not Catholic, who review medical records before and after the alleged healing. They look for natural explanations, misdiagnosis, spontaneous remission, psychosomatic improvement, placebo effect. Out of thousands of claimed healings over more than a century and a half, the Bureau has recognized 70 as medically inexplicable. 70, not thousands. 70, and of those 70, the Church has officially declared only a subset as miracles. Cases where the healing was not only medically inexplicable, but also instantaneous, complete, and permanent, with no possibility of relapse. I found the rejected cases more compelling than the approved ones. One file, dated 1953, concerned a woman from Belgium who had been diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. She visited Lourdes, bathed in the water, and returned home. 6 months later, her cancer was gone. Her doctors confirmed it. No tumours, no metastasis. The Medical Bureau's conclusion, healing confirmed. Natural explanation, delayed effect of previous chemotherapy cannot be entirely excluded. Case does not meet criteria for miracle. She was healed. But because there was a 1% chance, a theoretical possibility that something other than divine intervention had occurred, the case was rejected. Another file, from 1978, involved a child with severe epilepsy, seizures multiple times per day. No medication had worked. The family brought him to Lourdes. After bathing in the water, The seizures stopped. Completely. He never had another one. The Bureau's conclusion: spontaneous remission of epilepsy, while rare, is documented in medical literature, cannot be classified as miraculous. I began to see the pattern. It was looking for healings that defied every possible natural explanation, that left doctors with no choice but to shrug and admit ignorance. And even then, the Church hesitated. The Fatima file was different, thicker, more complex. In 1917, 3 shepherd children in Fatima, Portugal, claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to them on the 13th of every month from May through October. Mary revealed 3 secrets. The first 2 were made public: a vision of hell, a prophecy about the end of World War I, and the beginning of a second, greater war. Both were vague enough to fit many interpretations, but the third secret was kept sealed in the Vatican Archives for decades. It was not released until the year 2000, when Pope John Paul II authorized its publication. The official version described a vision of a bishop dressed in white, presumably a pope, being killed by soldiers. The Vatican interpreted this as a prophecy of the 1981 assassination attempt against John Paul, which he survived. But conspiracy theories flourished. Many believed the Vatican had released an edited version, that the real third secret predicted something far more catastrophic: the end of the Church, a great apostasy, perhaps even the end of the world. I found a note dated 1960, clipped to the original envelope that had contained the third secret. It was written by Cardinal Ottaviani, who had read the secret at Pope John XXIII's request. The note said simply, "The third secret must not be revealed. The faithful are not ready." Ready for what? The released version, describing the assassination attempt, did not seem particularly shocking. Disturbing, yes, but not world-ending. So why the decades of secrecy? Why the insistence that people were not ready? I do not know. The full text of what Lucia, the oldest of the 3 children, wrote down may be in these archives, or it may have been destroyed. Or the version released in 2000 may be exactly what she wrote, and the secrecy was simply institutional caution, the Church's instinct to control information even when the information is harmless. Mystery preserved is power maintained. The stigmata files fascinated me most. Stigmata, wounds resembling those of Christ's crucifixion, appearing spontaneously on a person's body, bleeding from the hands, feet, and side. The first recorded case was Saint Francis of Assisi in 1224. The most famous modern case was Padre Pio, an Italian Capuchin friar who bore the wounds for 50 years until his death in 1968. The Vatican investigated Padre Pio for decades. They suspected fraud, self-mutilation, psychological delusion. One investigator applied carbolic acid to the wounds, a substance that should have caused burns and scarring. Padre Pio's wounds were unaffected. They bled, but did not become infected. They remained open for 5 decades, then healed completely within days of his death, leaving no scars. In 2002, Pope John Paul II canonized him as a saint, but I found a report from 1919, written by a Vatican investigator, that cast doubt. Subject exhibits wounds consistent with repeated trauma. Psychological literature documents cases of individuals who, through intense meditation on Christ's suffering, develop psychosomatic manifestations, including bleeding. This does not necessarily indicate divine origin. The investigator's conclusion: unexplained does not mean miraculous. Recommend continued observation. Continued observation lasted 40 years. Even after canonization, even after the Church declared Padre Pio a saint, the ambiguity remained in the files. He was either touched by God or suffering from an extreme psychosomatic condition. Both explanations were documented. Neither was definitively proven, and that, I realized, was the secret the Vatican kept about miracles. They are always ambiguous. Always. If a miracle were undeniable, if God reached down and healed someone in a way that left no room for doubt, no possibility of natural explanation, then faith would become unnecessary. Knowledge would replace it, and the Church does not want a world where God's existence is proven beyond question. Because proven faith is not faith at all. Faith requires uncertainty. It requires the possibility of being wrong, and miracles, the real ones, live in that space between the explainable and the inexplicable, where both belief and doubt can find justification. I found a file on weeping statues, hundreds of cases from every continent, spanning centuries. Statues of Mary or Jesus that allegedly shed tears, or blood, or oil. Most were exposed as hoaxes, water pipes hidden in the statue's base, chemical reactions in porous materials, condensation mistaken for tears, in some cases, deliberate fraud, people seeking attention, or donations, or simply the thrill of creating a spectacle. But a few cases resisted explanation. One from Civitavecchia, Italy, in 1995. A small statue of the Virgin Mary, kept in a private home, began weeping tears that were tested and found to be human blood. Type O, female. The Vatican sent investigators. They interviewed the family, examined the statue, tested the substance. It was blood, human blood, and there was no clear source, no wounds on the statue, no mechanism for fraud that the investigators could detect. The investigation concluded with a statement that was both careful and unsatisfying. The phenomenon remains unexplained. The origin of the blood cannot be determined through available scientific means. The case is closed without classification. Not a miracle, not a hoax, just unexplained. And in the Vatican's calculus, unexplained is safer than either alternative. The exorcism files were kept in a separate section, restricted even within the archive. I was not supposed to access them, but the archivist who had grown to trust me, or perhaps pity me, allowed me a brief look. The criteria for approving an exorcism are stringent. The person must exhibit signs that cannot be explained by mental illness, knowledge they should not possess, languages they have never learned, aversion to sacred objects, superhuman strength. Most requests are denied. Schizophrenia, epilepsy, dissociative disorders, trauma. The Church has learned, slowly, painfully, that what previous generations called possession is more often pathology. But there were cases that troubled even the skeptical investigators. One, from Germany in 1974, involved a young woman who spoke fluent Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke during her episodes. She had no education beyond secondary school, no exposure to ancient languages. Linguistic experts confirmed she was not merely babbling, but speaking coherent sentences in a dialect that had been extinct for centuries. An exorcism was performed. The symptoms ceased. The file concluded, genuine possession or extraordinary psychological phenomenon producing glossolalia with apparent linguistic structure, unable to determine with certainty. Unable to determine with certainty. That phrase appeared again and again in the miracle files. The Church's way of saying, we do not know, we cannot know, and perhaps it is better not to know. I closed the last file as the archive's lights began to dim, signalling the end of the day. My hands were stiff from hours of turning pages, my eyes tired from reading faded ink by lamplight. I had read hundreds of miracle investigations. I had seen the Church's skepticism, its rigorous standards, its refusal to accept the supernatural without exhausting every natural explanation first. And I had also seen its fear of being fooled, fear of endorsing frauds. But deeper than that, fear of the genuine article, fear that if God truly broke into the world in ways that could not be denied, the Church would lose control of the narrative, would become a witness rather than an interpreter. Miracles, I understood, were not gifts the Church celebrated. They were problems it managed, evidence it catalogued and filed, neither destroying nor fully embracing, keeping always in that careful space between affirmation and denial. The Virgin Mary might have appeared at Fatima, or 3 children might have shared a vision born of poverty, religious fervour, and the trauma of living through a world war. Both are possible. Both are in the files. God might speak through miracles, or the human mind, desperate for meaning, might create experiences that feel transcendent but originate within. The Vatican has spent centuries investigating, and after all that investigation, After all those files, all those testimonies, all that evidence examined and cross-examined, the answer they arrived at is this: maybe. God, if he speaks through miracles, speaks in a whisper, and the Vatican listens with doubt, as though afraid of what certainty might cost them. I have shown you what I found. I cannot tell you what it means. That is for you to decide, in the silence of your own night, when the questions outnumber the answers, and faith, if it comes at all, comes not as certainty, but as a choice to believe despite the doubt. If this journey has meant something to you, if these hidden rooms have revealed questions worth carrying forward, I ask you to subscribe, not for my sake, but so others may find these mysteries when they are ready, when their own doubts have made them brave enough to look for answers that may never come. The final doors are opening now, and what waits beyond them is older than miracles, stranger than saints, whispered in prophecies that might be fiction or might be the last words God ever spoke to those who claimed to speak for him. The prophecy was written on vellum so old it felt like touching paper made of light, or so the legend claimed, because no one, as far as I could determine, had ever actually seen the original. What existed were copies of copies, transcriptions made centuries after the document supposedly first appeared, each one claiming to preserve the words of a 12th century Irish saint who had visited Rome and received a vision of every pope who would ever lead the church until its final days. Saint Malachy, Archbishop of Armagh, died 1148, never canonized during his lifetime, though miracles were attributed to him after his death. A man of prophecy, his followers said, a man who saw the future written in symbols and cryptic Latin phrases. The prophecy of the popes first appeared in print in 1595, published by a Benedictine monk named Arnold Wyon, 447 years after Malachy's death. And that delay, that enormous gap between alleged vision and documented text, should have ended the matter immediately. But it did not, because the prophecy was eerily accurate for the popes who came before 1595, and maddeningly vague for everyone who came after. I found the Vatican's own investigation of the prophecy in a folder marked Prophetia Malachiae Examinatio et Refutatio, Malachy's Prophecy, Examination and Refutation. The file was dated 1623, commissioned by Pope Urban VIII, who wanted to know whether this text circulating among the faithful had any validity. The scholars Urban assigned to study it reached a conclusion that was both definitive and entirely ignored. The prophecy displays remarkable specificity regarding pontiffs prior to its publication in 1595, suggesting composition with benefit of historical knowledge. Descriptions of popes subsequent to 1595 are sufficiently vague to permit multiple interpretations. Conclusion: probable forgery created circa 1590. Purpose unknown. Recommend ecclesiastical censure. The recommendation was filed. No censure was issued. The prophecy continued to circulate because people wanted it to be true, wanted to believe that history had a shape, a direction, an ending that had been foreseen, that the chaos of succession, schism, and reform was all part of a divine plan written in stars and saints' visions. The prophecy consists of 112 short Latin phrases, each supposedly describing a pope. Some are straightforward, some are poetic, some are incomprehensible. Pope number 60, described as De Mediatate Lunae, from the half moon. This was Clement VII, whose family coat of arms featured a crescent moon. Perfect match. Pope number 95, Religio Depopulata. This was Benedict XV, who reigned during World War I, when faith collapsed across Europe, when churches emptied and a generation lost belief in divine providence as they drowned in the mud of Flanders. Pope number 110, De Laboris Solis. From the labour of the sun, John Paul II, born during a solar eclipse, buried during a solar eclipse. The sun laboured twice to mark his time on Earth. Coincidence? Interpretation shaped by hindsight? Or something else? The problem with prophecy is that it becomes true by being believed. People look for patterns. They find them, and once found, the pattern seems inevitable, as though it had always been there, waiting to be discovered. I found marginal notes in the Vatican file, annotations added over centuries as new popes were elected, and believers tried to fit them into Malachi's scheme. Pope number 111 was described as Gloria Olivae. Benedict XVI took his name from Saint Benedict, whose order, the Benedictines, uses the olive branch as a symbol. It fit, not perfectly, but close enough. And then there was the final entry. Number 112. In persecutione extrema sacrae Romanae ecclesiae sedabit Petrus Romanus, qui passet oves in multis tribulationibus, quibus transactis civitas septicolis diruetur, e iudex tremendus iudicabit populum suum. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations. And when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. Peter the Roman, the last pope. The end of the church. The end of Rome. The end of the world, or at least the world as it had been known for 2,000 years. Pope Francis, elected in 2013, is the 266th pope in the official Vatican count. If Malachi's prophecy lists 112 popes starting from 1143, the math does not align. Some popes reigned for weeks, some for decades, some were anti-popes, claimants whose legitimacy was disputed. The numbering systems do not match, but believers found a way. They argued that Malachi skipped certain popes, that the list was never meant to be comprehensive, only symbolic. They counted and recounted, adjusted and reinterpreted, until Francis became the final pope. Or close enough to final that the prophecy's shadow fell across his papacy. Francis chose his name after Saint Francis of Assisi, not after any Peter, but some argued that the prophecy did not require the name Peter, only the Spirit, that Francis, like Peter, would shepherd the flock through tribulation, and there has been tribulation. The abuse crisis that has shaken the church to its foundation, declining attendance across Europe and the Americas, schism threatened by conservative factions who believe Francis has betrayed tradition, financial scandals, calls for reform that the institution resists with the inertia of 2 millennia. The city of 7 hills, Rome, has not been destroyed. Not literally, but metaphorically, the Rome that once commanded empires, that crowned kings and deposed them, that held spiritual authority over 1 billion souls, that Rome is fading, and Francis knows it. I found a memorandum dated 2014, written by a Vatican historian tasked with advising Francis on the prophecy. The memo was brief, almost dismissive. The prophecy of Malachi is a 16th century fabrication. It has no theological or historical validity. However, its persistence in popular belief creates a narrative expectation that may influence public perception of the Holy Father's papacy. Recommend neither endorsement nor refutation. Silence is sufficient. Silence is sufficient. The Vatican's preferred response to questions it cannot answer and does not wish to engage. But silence did not stop people from believing. From watching Francis, now in his late 80s, aging visibly, walking with difficulty, and wondering whether he would be the last, whether the prophecy, false though it likely was, had stumbled into truth by accident, or by the strange way that stories, repeated often enough, begin to shape the reality they claim to predict. I held the prophecy in my hands, or rather, a copy of it. 18th century, beautifully transcribed, each pope's motto written in careful calligraphy. The parchment was not ancient, despite its claims. But when I read Petrus Romanus, I felt something, not belief. Not exactly, but a recognition that prophecies work not because they predict the future, but because they shape how we see the present. If you believe the church will end, you look for signs of ending, and you will find them. Declining vocations, churches closing, scandals that seem to multiply faster than they can be addressed, a world growing secular, indifferent, hostile even to institutions that once defined civilization. All of this is real. None of it requires a 12th century saint's vision to explain, but the prophecy gives the decline a narrative, a meaning, an inevitability. It transforms institutional failure into cosmic drama. It says that what is happening now was always meant to happen, that it is not decay but destiny. And perhaps that is comforting in a way, to believe that when the church falls, if it falls, it will be because God ordained it, not because humans failed to live up to the ideals they claimed to serve. I found one more note, undated, unsigned, tucked into the back of the file. It was written in Italian, in a hand I did not recognize. We cannot know if Malachi saw the future, but we know this. Every institution ends. Every empire falls. Every certainty, given enough time, becomes a question. Perhaps the prophecy is true not because a saint foresaw our ending, but because all things end. And we, knowing this, invented a saint to make the ending bearable. The Vatican has never officially endorsed the prophecy of the popes, has never officially condemned it either. It exists in that space the Church reserves for mysteries it cannot control and will not acknowledge, the space where doubt and belief can coexist without resolution. Francis may be the last pope, or he may not. The Church may end in his lifetime, or it may endure another 1,000 years, adapting as it has always adapted, surviving as it has always survived. But the prophecy will remain, copied and shared, interpreted and reinterpreted, believed by some, dismissed by others, and used by everyone who looks at the present moment and tries to find in it a pattern, a meaning, a story that makes sense of chaos. Prophecies are not about the future. They are about the present, about our need to believe that what we are living through matters, that it was foreseen, that it has a place in a larger story whose ending, terrible or glorious, gives meaning to everything that came before. I do not know if Saint Malachi saw anything, but I know that someone in 1595 wrote a document that has haunted the Vatican for over 400 years, and I know that Francis, whether he is the last pope or not, leads a church that is smaller, quieter, less certain of its place in the world than it has been in centuries. The prophecy says the city of 7 hills will be destroyed. Rome still stands, but the Rome that crowned emperors, that commanded crusades, that spoke with the voice of God to princes and peasants alike, that Rome is already gone. What remains is a question, and the prophecy, true or false, is simply another way of asking it. How does an empire of faith end? With fire and judgment, or with silence, as the last believers turn out the lights and walk away into a world that has learned to live without answers? They wrote in secret, not because writing was forbidden. Women in medieval convents were often more literate than their male counterparts, but because what they wrote challenged the assumption that divine revelation flowed only through men. The folder was thin compared to the others I had examined. Mystici Feminae, Scripta non authenticata, female mystics, writings not authenticated. Inside were manuscripts, some in Latin, some in medieval German or Italian, written by women whose names have been forgotten by everyone except a handful of scholars who specialize in recovering voices the Church chose not to amplify. Hildegard of Bingen was the exception. A 12th century Benedictine abbess who composed music, wrote treatises on medicine and natural history, and recorded visions she claimed came directly from God. She corresponded with popes and emperors. Her writings were approved, celebrated even. But Hildegard succeeded because she was careful. She framed her authority as reluctant, claimed she was merely a vessel, a poor, unlearned woman through whom God chose to speak. She diminished herself repeatedly in her writings, insisting she had no wisdom of her own, that everything came from divine illumination. Whether she believed this, or whether it was a strategic performance designed to avoid the fate of women who claimed authority too boldly, I cannot say. But the performance worked. She died in her bed at 81, venerated as a saint, her writings preserved. Others were not so fortunate. Marguerite Porete wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. It was beautiful, mystical, radical. She argued that the soul, through love, could achieve such complete union with God that it no longer needed the Church as mediator. That advanced souls could transcend religious law, could live in a state of divine freedom, where conventional morality no longer applied. The Church condemned it as heresy. Marguerite was arrested, tried by the Inquisition, and when she refused to recant, she was burned at the stake in Paris on June 1st. 1310, her book was banned. Copies were hunted down and destroyed. For 600 years, it was forgotten. The author's name erased, even from the lists of condemned heretics. Then, in 1946, a scholar discovered a manuscript in a monastic library. It was labeled as an anonymous mystical text. Only through careful textual analysis did researchers realize it was Marguerite's lost work, preserved by accident or perhaps by monks who recognized its spiritual depth, even if they could not acknowledge its condemned author. I found a Vatican file on Marguerite, dated 1309, a year before her execution. It contained a letter from a bishop warning the Inquisition that she was spreading dangerous ideas, that women were gathering to read her book, that her claim that souls could be free from ecclesiastical authority threatened the entire structure of the church. The reply from the inquisitor was brief. Silentium per ignem. Silence through fire. They burned the woman. They burned her books, but the ideas survived, copied by hand, passed along in secret, until centuries later, someone brave or foolish enough recognized what had been lost and brought it back into the light. Julian of Norwich wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English by a woman. She described God with feminine imagery, called God Mother as often as Father, wrote of divine love as nurturing, tender, intimate in ways that made her theology feel dangerous, even as her language remained devotional. She was not condemned, but she was not celebrated either. Her work circulated in limited copies, read by small communities, never promoted by the church, never declared heretical enough to burn but never orthodox enough to endorse. She existed in ecclesiastical limbo for 600 years, until 20th century feminists rediscovered her and made her a symbol of what the church had almost allowed to disappear. The pattern was clear. Women could write theology, could record visions, could claim mystical authority, but only if they were careful, only if they framed their knowledge as passive reception rather than active intellect, only if they humbled themselves repeatedly, insisting they were unworthy vessels rather than thinking, questioning, interpreting souls. And even then, even with all that careful self-diminishment, their work was rarely preserved with the same care given to male theologians. It survived by accident, by the devotion of small communities, by being forgotten just enough that later generations could rediscover it without confronting the fact that it had been deliberately ignored. But the erasure was not always subtle. In 591, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily that would shape how Christians understood Mary Magdalene for the next 1400 years. He declared that 3 separate women mentioned in the Gospels, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and an unnamed sinful woman, were all the same person, and that person was a prostitute whom Jesus had saved from her sins. There is no biblical basis for this conflation, none. The Gospels never call Mary Magdalene a prostitute. They call her a devoted follower, a witness to the crucifixion when the male disciples fled. But Gregory needed a narrative. He needed women in the church to understand their place. And that place was subordinate, redeemed through male grace, exemplars of sin overcome rather than faith chosen. For 14 centuries, that lie was taught as truth. Mary Magdalene became a symbol of sexual sin and repentance. Paintings showed her weeping, half naked, gazing up at Jesus with the desperate gratitude of someone who knew she did not deserve salvation. In 1969, the Vatican quietly corrected the error, separated the 3 Marys, acknowledged that the conflation had been a mistake. No apology, no explanation of why it had taken 1400 years, just a revision in the liturgical calendar that most Catholics never noticed. Then, in 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to the rank of the Apostles, officially recognized her as Apostle to the Apostles. 2,000 years after her death, the Church finally acknowledged what the Gospels had said all along. I found a file from 1572, a proposal from a group of nuns requesting permission to preach in their convent's chapel. They did not ask to preach in public, only to their own community, to share theological reflections during services. The response from the Vatican was a single line, Mulieres in ecclesia tacent. Let women be silent in church. St. Paul's words, written in the 1st century, used for centuries to silence half of humanity. But Paul also wrote that in Christ there is neither male nor female, that all are one in the body of believers. That passage was quoted less frequently. The church chose which of Paul's words to emphasize, chose which verses defined doctrine and which could be contextualized, historicized, explained away as applying only to specific situations in specific churches in the first century. Women must be silent became eternal law. All are one became poetic metaphor. In 1976, the Vatican issued a declaration titled Inter Inseniores, Among the Reasons. It stated definitively that women could not be ordained as priests because Jesus had chosen only men as apostles. The document acknowledged that Jesus had treated women with unusual respect for his time, that women had been among his closest followers, that the cultural context of first-century Palestine limited what roles women could publicly assume. But then it concluded that Jesus' choice of male apostles was not cultural or contextual but theological. A divine decision that bound the church for all time. In 2010, the Vatican declared that attempting to ordain a woman was a grave crime, equivalent in severity to sexually abusing a child. Think about that equation. A woman seeking to serve God as a priest placed in the same moral category as someone who destroyed a child's life. The outcry was immediate. The comparison was quietly walked back, but the prohibition remains still. I read the theological writings of women who were told they could not teach. Their Latin was as elegant as any cardinal's, their logic as rigorous as any church fathers, their insights into scripture as profound as Augustine or Aquinas. But they were women, and so their work was archived, not celebrated, copied by devoted followers, not published by the church, read in convents and private homes, not studied in seminaries. They wrote in the margins of history, and the church, when it remembered them at all, treated them as curiosities, exceptional cases that proved the rule rather than challenged it. The final document in the file was dated 2022, a petition from Catholic women's organizations requesting that the question of female ordination be reopened for theological discussion. The Vatican's response, issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, stated that the matter was closed, that Pope John Paul II's 1994 declaration that the Church had no authority to ordain women was definitive and not subject to debate. Definitive, not open for discussion, not a teaching that could develop, as so many other teachings had developed over 2,000 years, but a closed door. Locked. Final. I thought about Marguerite, burning, about Julian, writing in her anchorite cell, about Mary Magdalene, recast as a prostitute because her actual story, her authority, her intimacy with Christ, threatened men who claimed her faith was inferior to theirs. I thought about all the women whose names I would never know, whose writings did not survive, whose voices were silenced not by fire but by simple neglect, by the quiet decision not to copy their manuscripts, not to teach their theology, not to remember them as anything other than footnotes in a history written by men. The Church says women cannot be priests because Jesus chose men, but Jesus also chose Jews. Yet, the Church ordains Gentiles. The logic is inconsistent, but consistency has never been the point. The point has always been power. Who holds it? Who defines it? Who gets to speak for God? And who must remain silent? They wrote in secret. And in that silence, in the spaces between what was permitted and what was necessary, they found God anyway. Not the God of hierarchies and prohibitions, but a God who spoke to those the institution had declared unworthy of hearing. Their words survive. Fragmented, scattered, archived under labels that dismiss rather than celebrate, but they survive. And that survival, against 14 centuries of erasure, is its own kind of miracle. I returned to the room one final time. The wooden door, inscribed with Veritas Temporis Est. Truth belongs to time. The small chamber with no shelves, no files, only a desk and a book with blank pages waiting for words that would never be written. The elderly archivist had told me, years ago when I first entered these vaults, that this was where no more questions were asked, only listening remained. I sat at the desk and thought about everything I had seen. the trial records of men tortured into confessions, the letters from rabbis begging the Vatican to affirm that God was not silent, the paintings locked in darkness because they showed suffering as it truly appears, rather than as theology prefers to imagine it, the documents that proved the Church had known about genocide and chosen calculation over courage, the women whose voices were archived rather than amplified because their gender disqualified their wisdom, all of it preserved, none of it destroyed. The Vatican does not burn evidence. That would be admission of guilt, acknowledgement that the evidence has power. Instead, it archives, files, catalogues, preserves everything in rooms that require 3 iron doors and special permission and decades of waiting before anyone is allowed to see what was always meant to remain hidden. Why? Not to control the past, though it does that. Not merely to protect institutional power, though it does that too. The Vatican preserves because it understands something about truth that most of us resist. That truth is not simple, not singular, not the kind of thing that can be spoken once and settled forever. Truth is layered, contradictory, full of gaps where certainty should be and certainty where doubt would be wiser. It includes popes who saved thousands and remained silent about millions, artists who painted divinity and were condemned for showing it too clearly, prophets who might have been forgers and miracles that might have been misdiagnoses, and women who heard God speak but were told their hearing was defective because of their sex. All of it true. All of it preserved. I have shown you what I found in those locked rooms. I cannot tell you what it means. Meaning belongs to you, to the questions you carry, to the doubts that brought you here and will follow you when you leave. What I can tell you is this. The Vatican Archives is not where truth is buried. It is where truth is protected from being made too simple, too clean, too easy to weaponize for whoever holds power in any given century. They wait. These documents, these paintings, these letters never answered and speeches never delivered. They wait for generations ready to look at faith not as it wishes to be seen but as it has actually been lived, by saints who faltered, believers who doubted, institutions that chose power over witness, and then, sometimes, chose witness anyway. If what you have heard tonight feels like more than a story, if it feels like a door quietly opening to something deeper than certainty, then perhaps you understand why I could not stay silent, why I chose to speak while breath remained. While someone might still listen, the 3 iron doors remain locked. But their secrets no longer belong only to the Vatican. They belong to you now. To carry forward, to question, to wrestle within the darkness when easy answers fail and all that remains is the harder work of sitting with ambiguity, with history's refusal to be simple, with faith that survives, not because it has no doubts, but because it has learned to hold doubt and belief in the same trembling hands. I have said what I needed to say. The candle burns low. The pages are closed. The archive waits in its eternal patience for the next soul brave enough or foolish enough to ask what was never meant to be answered. Sleep well. The doors of the Vatican will remain. They have waited centuries. They can wait one more night. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening with patience and heart, for having the courage to sit with questions that have no easy answers. Rest now. Truth belongs to time, and time, for tonight, belongs to silence.